I'm joined today by Briney, host of the Congressional Dish podcast, which exposes corporate influence in the bills and laws passed by Congress. Shortly before the New Year's break, Jen, we talked about this omnibus spending bill. It includes all sorts of spying provisions that were previously, we thought, defeated. Let's start at the very top. What is in this bill as far as these provisions are concerned?
Unfortunately, the bad news for you is the cybersecurity bill that everyone was worried about, CISA, which came from the Senate, made it into the omnibus and into law intact. It's almost word for word the same exact bill. And so what that does is it gives immunity to any private company that transfers information to the government. Now, the information that's allowed to be transferred is limited. It's supposed to be cyber threat indicators. The problem is that the version of this that made it into law says that anything that could potentially be harmed by a cybersecurity problem is eligible to be transferred to the government, and what couldn't potentially be harmed by a cybersecurity problem. And so it allows just about anything to be transferred, and any private company gets immunity from any of our lawsuits if they transfer our information. So it's pretty bad news.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you hear that, that when you hear subjectivity built into these bills in terms of what could be a threat or what might be related to national security, that should be a red flag because it is incredibly broad. And in addition, I'm curious what you know about this provision, which in prior bills said that personal information was to be scrubbed from cybersecurity reports. And my reading is that that provision is gone from what ultimately passed.
It is. So there's no requirement for our personal information when it comes from the private companies to the government. There's no requirement at all that the private companies have to delete that information. Now, in the bill, it does say that the government should delete that information, but the problem is, how do we know that they are? And so when you look at the oversight section of this, the oversight is just a bunch of reports, and they're all reports that come from inside the executive branch. So you have, all of this information is going to go from the Department of Homeland Security. That was decided in this bill. And so when you have the oversight also being, a bunch of positions that are appointed by the president, you can't have a system that's checks and balances if every single person involved is appointed by the president. And unfortunately, that's what we have here. As far as our privacy and civil liberties are concerned, those procedures were not written in CISA or in the Omnibus, which is what became law. Those procedures are going to be written by the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Homeland Security. And both of those, again, are presidential appointees. So there's nothing in here that has any teeth that's protecting our privacy.
Can you give our audience...
It's even...
Oh, no, so go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, what's going to happen is the Department of Homeland Security is going to be required to automatically share information with other parts of the government, including, this is not an exhaustive list, but the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So this is going all over the government, and then it specifically allows this information to be used against us in court for all kinds of crimes, including some that are also very broad, including possession of false identification, hacking, harboring a criminal, fraud, and unauthorized use of trade secrets, which is, this is not cybersecurity. This is using information that is transferred to the government for whatever reason against us in court. It's a very different thing from cybersecurity.
Can you give our audience some examples of online activities that they may participate in, that then the data about or information relating to those online activities may end up in the hands of authorities?
I think a really interesting example is one that was provided in the debate by Senator Ron Wyden, and he was talking about our health records, because more and more because our Obamacare system is a private insurance system, you have to share information about your health with your private insurer, obviously, because they need to pay the bills. Well, now that private insurance company is allowed to transfer anything that could possibly be stolen in a cybersecurity incident. They get immunity for transferring that to the government. So now the government can find out, do you have any history of mental illness? Have you ever been treated for depression, anxiety? Do you have any family history of those things? And so when you see things like, the gun debate, we're now talking about cracking down on people with mental illness. Well, now we know that they can get that information and they can use it. And we don't have any guarantees that it's going to be hiding our identities, because the problem is that when you give a company immunity for transferring anything, well, why would they ever scrub it themselves? They're not being required to. There's no repercussions if they don't, and it's more work for them to do so. So another good example would be banks. All of that is digital now. And so do you really want the government knowing exactly how much money you have because your bank turned it over? Well, your bank's going to have immunity for doing so. So it's anything. It could be hotels. It could be your apartment complex. Anything could be turned over if it's threatened by cybersecurity issues.
The two sort of broader stories here that are problematic are, and take whichever one of these you want to first, or whichever one of these you think requires more attention. Number one, on many issues, Republicans and Democrats are very, very different. Here, we saw House Democrats and Republicans overwhelmingly vote in favor of this broader omnibus spending bill by about the same, in about the same proportion or ratio. So that's one issue where Democrats and Republicans both part of the problem when it comes to this issue. Number two is this, I don't know if habit is the right term, but the constant coupling of unrelated bills and provisions together. Hey, who's not going to pass a bill to keep the government open? And by the way, all of these CISA provisions are included. There's no rule that says it has to be that way. These different issues could be tackled totally separately by our elected officials.
And they should. And I think you hit it right on the head. It's really hard for us to hold our representatives accountable for this vote because it was attached to the 2016 government funding. And so the choice is you either shut down the government or you vote against this cybersecurity legislation, which, by the way, not many people read this stuff, apparently. And so they didn't even know that this was in there. And how could they? This was 2009 pages. It was available for 2.5 days. It was released in the middle of the night on a Wednesday, and they voted at noon on Friday.
Right.
So, and this started on page 728. So there were a lot of people that didn't know it was in there. I watched the House Rules Committee, which was the only hearing on this that ever took place. And if it wasn't for Representative Justin Amash, who ran in at the end of the hearing and said, hey, by the way, this is in there, even the people on the House Rules Committee didn't know it was there. Representative Louise Slaughter of New York said it out loud. She said, I didn't know this was there. And so you also have representatives that just were unaware of its existence. And it's a huge problem. Most of the things that are becoming law that we wouldn't want to become law are happening in this fashion. And it happens every year that the government isn't funded on time, which, well, is every year. So I've never seen it funded properly, and it is a huge, huge problem. And it's why stuff like this is allowed to happen.
To what extent can the average person protect themselves? Are there any ways? You hear about browsers that cloak your identity. You hear about different pieces of software that can block unauthorized access to a certain degree. But of course, your internet service provider may be able to override anything that you can actually do at your local computer level. Are you hearing about actions that individuals can take to push back against this?
I mean, no.
Right.
I wish I had a better answer for you, but no. I mean, some people believe in encryption. I just feel like if there's anything I don't want the government to know, if I need to tell a friend something, I'm going to do it in person. And I'm just kind of resigned at this point that the government can have all of my digital information. Unfortunately, that's where I'm at.
I don't think a good argument is, hey, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. I think that's a terrible, terrible argument. But on a personal level, I sort of operate under the assumption that if the government wants to look into my business emails and what I'm up to, they probably are able to. And if I really need to have what I would consider a private conversation, I just shouldn't do it with any sort of electronic means. It seems to be sort of an unfortunate reality today.
Yeah, and that's where I'm at. And there is one more thing before we wrap up here that I do want to mention, which is that in the debate on CISA, when it originally passed on its own, this was the argument people were having, that this was way too broad and it was basically surveillance being disguised as cybersecurity.
Right.
And I think what proved it is that they attached a second bill to the Omnibus, which actually does something about cybersecurity. And what it does is it has the Department of Homeland Security there within a year. they're going to issue binding operational directives to the other agencies in the government, requiring encryption, a single sign-in location for all of the different government employees, and a multi-factor authentication for when they sign on. So it's like they'll have to, do the addition and then what is your old dog's name, like a multi-step
Right.
Sign-in thing. And that actually does something about cybersecurity. And this wasn't in the original CISA. It wasn't in the two cybersecurity bills that passed the House. It was brand new. It made it into law. And so that just kind of proved to me that this never was about cybersecurity. This was about surveillance. And because of one of the big arguments was, well, this doesn't do anything about cybersecurity, they ended up doing something about cybersecurity when it eventually became law. So, yeah, I think all of the paranoia about CISA, I think it's legit having read the actual legislation, and unfortunately it's law. And I think the only chance that we have of getting rid of it at this point is the unlikely scenario is a big backlash. So all of us writing to our representatives and senators, especially in an election year, and saying, I know this became law and it shouldn't have, and I want it repealed. That's one avenue. The other one is that the stuff we're concerned about expires in 10 years, in 2025. And so maybe we can just stop it from being renewed. But that's the only hope I have.
Yeah, well, we've got 10 years to figure that one out, or I guess 9 at this point. So we should, at minimum, be able to get that done, right? We've been speaking with Jen Briney, host of the Congressional Dish podcast. Thanks, as always, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.